Hi everyone, this is Nicholas Karn. This is my EDL 853 Module 8 case study, Get This Child Out of My Room. So just a quick summary, we have three people kind of involved in the story. We have Carl the student, this is Nancy Taylor the teacher, and Susan Green, who is a special education teacher. Carl's behavior has become abusive and Mrs. Taylor is feeling threatened by Carl's behavior and goes to Miss Green, his special education teacher, to get him removed from the classroom. So first, what do we know? Carl's behavior has changed after his parents' divorce 3 months prior, and so we go into kind of the details of the school. The Fulton School District is a very rural school district. They have to share a lot of resources like psychologists, nurses, and social workers. Carl's special education teacher is Miss Green, as stated earlier, and is brand new to the district, and she's replacing a teacher called Mrs. Lee, who had been there for 25 years. And Carl has turned from self-abuse to now the staff, including Mrs. Taylor. And again, Mrs. Taylor wants Carl out of her room. So what do we need to know? I want to know what are some of the resources that aren't described in the case study. They do say they're limited, but maybe there are some other ways to support Carl. And also, what are some details of the so-called simple IEP that Mrs. Lewis constructed for Carl, and kind of understanding what worked for her and maybe what did not work. And obviously Mrs. Taylor felt more comfortable with Mrs. Lewis because Carl had a better plan with her. So maybe finding out what was actually in that IEP. And then did Mrs. Taylor take any steps prior to wanting Carl removed because of his behavior? Now obviously if there was nothing leading up to it and Carl just kind of went off and started being violent in the classroom, then there's not much she can do. But at the same time, did she have a conversation with Carl at all about his behavior? And then now we can identify the issues that we've kind of seen what we know and what we need to know. The main issue in the case study is whatever's happening, Carl's not getting the proper needs met by the school district. And Carl's IEP constructed in the past was designed to remove Carl whenever he had a behavioral issue in the classroom instead of actually solving the issue. Another issue is Carl's home life and the apparent stress it puts on him because of his parents' divorce. And then finally, another issue is that some of the adults in the school are not taking time to talk to Carl about his home life. Next, we can start making a plan of action with the appropriate strategies. So here's just the overall list of what I would do, but I'm going to go through each one and kind of talk about what I would do as far as details and then how it would work in the real world. So first thing I would do is, obviously, like I said before, revisit the IEP. It's not effective for Carl's new behaviors, so we need to revisit it and conduct an IEP meeting as soon as possible, which Miss Green technically did with the parents, but it wasn't necessarily as a staff. It was just between her, the parents. I don't know if there was an administrator involved at all. I feel like an administrator needs to be present for that meeting as well. Background and preference assessment, kind of just really it's a fancy way of saying we need to get to know Carl, and it'd be beneficial to Miss Green, who has never taught Carl before, to figure out some things about him. And we can go into cognitive, expressive, social, and his motor skills. We can also find out some of their strengths and kind of figure out what works for him emotionally, socially, academically, and others. Also, what are things that maybe he prefers? It can be as simple as something as a snack, food, toy, maybe a privilege. Maybe he enjoys certain people that we can talk to and kind of figure out what they do with him. And then we do our functional behavior assessment. We kind of identify the behavior we want to stop, which clearly is the abusive behavior and and it just seems like they're random acts of defiance. We need to figure out what exactly the behavior is and be very detailed with that so we can learn how to stop it. And then what are some reasons for that behavior, not just say, okay, here's the behavior, but also what's a reason for it. In this case, we would understand that it could be the stress of the parents' divorce. So possible interventions as well as our 4 steps. So what interventions can be implemented to kind of stop the behavior or prevent it from happening in the first place. So you look at, when is it escalating? What are some warning signs? And then how can we intervene to stop them? Maybe the parents know something. Maybe better teachers know something than me. I don't know, but we got to figure out something, and as an administrator you can kind of pull resources together to find out what interventions can be done and support the teachers and the IEP team. And then finally you have your evaluation, which is where we just sit around as a team and discuss what's working well, what's not, and maybe adjust some strategies. We'll have an evaluation in the 3 weeks after the plan has been implemented, and then again in 6 weeks. And if the evaluations show negative growth or kind of stagnant growth, nothing's changing, then we need to revisit the plan again and find out what we can change. And this is all in the St. Paul Public Schools action plan, which is really good stuff. So if you want to click on the link there, you can look at it. We've used it in the past at my school, and it seems to work pretty well for most of our students. All right, so the third step here was, how would this strategy promote the success of all students? Well, I believe that if there's an abusive behavior in the classroom, and we reduce that for the individual student, it actually benefits all students. If you have one student who's being abusive or defiant in the class, it throws off the whole chemistry of the classroom. The teachers don't feel comfortable teaching, and there's just something that gets lost there. And so we want to make sure that classroom management is on point. We want to make sure that the behavior stops, and doing that in a positive way, not a negative way. And in this case, Carl was throwing rocks at the staff from the bus, and he also threw a sharpened pencil at particularly Mrs. Taylor. So Carl in the past had never carried out violent acts towards students, but since it's escalated to teachers now, possibly the next step could be students. So we want to make sure we don't cause harm to staff or students, so promoting a safe environment in our school. If we can also identify the problem and come up with a solution, then students like Carl will actually experience more success and want to come to school more and not disturb the class. So we have to find ways for kids to have success and make sure that they enjoy actually coming to school, not dread it every single day, which would cause more negative behaviors. And then we also need to debrief the problem. So what was I thinking, feeling, and valuing throughout this? Well, I was thinking, how come many adults don't know about Carl and his family issues? Maybe they did, but the case study didn't really say, what Carl was the teachers didn't know what Carl was going through. They just knew his behavior had changed and they wanted it to stop. So to me, as a teacher, I would try to identify what is causing behavior before I want the student removed. Now, obviously, his behavior was violent, and maybe the teacher, Mrs. Taylor, did say she did not feel safe. So that is an issue, but at the same time, taking a little extra time out of the day to kind of figure out what is actually happening to the student. And I believe that starts with building relationships with them on day one. I was also feeling frustrated with the relationship with Mrs. Taylor and Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Green. So Mrs. Lewis is gone, but really she kind of set Miss Green up for failure, just because Miss Green did not quite understand Carl or his background yet, and Carl was becoming increasingly abusive, and really the first strategy was to remove Carl rather than actually work with him and take the time. So I was kind of frustrated with that, because I feel like you should take time to actually work with students, and I think you should have a system in place at your school to make sure that things are being handled in the classroom first, but if it can't get handled in the classroom, then it does come to special education, then it does come to the administration. But I also didn't hear much about the administration even being involved, so I don't know how much really effort was put in to find ways to work with Carl. I value the collaboration a little bit, though, with Mrs. Taylor and Miss Green, even though it seemed confrontational a little bit. But I do admire that she did go to Miss Green first and say, hey, I need help, but she just demanded that the kid was actually removed from her class. She didn't really ask for that help. But at least there's that climate in the school to say, I'm going to go to someone who has expertise in this area, even if she is new. And I know a lot of teachers don't feel like talking to a new teacher because they feel like they don't know what they're doing. But Mrs. Taylor just wanted to communicate that with Miss Green, and obviously it was done in maybe not the most professional way, but at the same time, they were collaborating. But I do appreciate the collaboration at my school. We have regular meetings all the time about students and to better their IEPs, and implement new strategies or take old strategies away. I'm always in a meeting, and most teachers don't like that, but I do, because I like to have as much input as possible for that student. And I hope that anybody who becomes an administrator would value that as well. So the unresolved issue obviously is I want to know what happens to Carl and his family issues if it can be resolved, and what does Miss Green do after the IEP meeting at the end to resolve these behavioral issues with Carl. Maybe she comes up with a better strategy. Maybe she uses Mrs. Lewis's old strategy. I'm not sure, but that's just something that I think is still an issue. Carl doesn't seem to be making much of a progress there, so I want to know what happens after that. And then what would I do to enhance the academic success by enhancing instructional capacity? I think as an administrator, you need to make sure that the intervention plan's set up for each student that needs them and provide the resources required with what you have. I would also like to have conversations with the staff. It seems like it'd be easier at this school because it's a smaller school, but definitely if I was in this case, I'd talk to Miss Green and Mrs. Taylor to try to work as a team to come up with a better solution for Carl. And finally, I'd like to sit down with Carl and his family to figure out what do we need to do at home to help Carl, because clearly something's affecting him at home, and we want to make sure that it's not necessarily just school that we're trying to fix him and try to help him. We're trying to help him at home too, and really that's where it all seems to be stemming from. So kind of figure out a solution to that. Sometimes it's time, and sometimes it's support, whatever it may be, but we need to have that conversation. Also, we need to promote the well-being of every student, and that's spiritually, it's emotionally, and really look at the inside of our kids, get to know our kids. And I would definitely fix this by making sure that we don't assume behavior is because they're a bad kid. We don't just come to a conclusion right away. We try to research, we try to find out, we communicate, and figure out what is going on with that student. And maybe it's a thing we can fix, but also taking the time to talk to them and understand them sometimes helps as well. And using a multi-tiered system, we can do everything in our power to address students' needs in many ways as possible. And then instead of actually removing, in this case, Carl from class and putting him into a resource room, or a student from class, I don't think that really solves the issue all the time. So we would just need to have this very specific guideline on, all right, we see the behavior escalating, what can we do to intervene before the behavior gets worse, and maybe it leads to something that could cause harm to the student or to other students. And really the last thing is just to, as a school leader, I would try to create a climate of student first mentality. We are a family at our school. We want to make sure that we're taking care of teachers, staff, but really we're here to ultimately serve the students. So making sure we have that climate that we need to build relationships with our students, and we need to really work with them and make sure that we're putting them first rather than our own needs. Collaboration with us as a staff, PLC time, professional development, whatever else we can find time to have those conversations about students. Communication with all parties involved. That includes staff, that includes administration, that includes parents, or anybody at home who's taking care of the student. We want to raise the kid as a village. We don't want to do it in separate identities. So we want it really, the more people we have involved that are on the student side, the better. So just a conclusion here, in this case study, we learned a lot of different things on how we can be better as administrators and even educators. And we can talk about it all we want, and we can come up with these great plans, but it's up to us to kind of follow through on them, follow the law, and make sure that we are doing everything in our power to help every single student at our schools. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to watching all of yours as well. Thank you.